Assalamu alaikum. Today we will discuss the problem of suffering, exploring how Islamic theology reconciles divine mercy with worldly pain compared to atheistic viewpoints. It's a profound philosophical question, right? One that humanity has literally wrestled with for centuries. In this explainer, we're going to unpack this complex issue logically. We'll be examining the nature of divine attributes, the real limitations of human perception, and the ultimate purpose of earthly trials. Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for this session. We'll start with the whiskey analogy, move into egocentrism and divine wisdom, and then look at the story of Moses and limited perspective. After that, we'll cover free will and moral growth, suffering as spiritual purification, and finally, finding peace and purpose. Let's dive right into section 1, the whiskey analogy, which is really all about perspective. Imagine a young, inquisitive kid watching an adult sip a glass of golden, smooth liquid whiskey. Naturally, the child wants some, but every single time he reaches for it, his parents intervene, and he ends up getting in trouble. To that child, the parents seem incredibly mean and restrictive. He completely lacks the biological knowledge to understand that a 40% alcohol drink would severely poison his young stomach and liver. Fast forward to adulthood, and the parents' reasoning becomes blindingly obvious. We can actually use this to contrast our two worldviews. The atheistic perspective is a lot like that angry child, assuming that because suffering exists, a loving God simply cannot. The structured Islamic view, on the other hand, represents the adult's perspective, understanding that humanity often lacks the transcendent knowledge required to grasp the ultimate divine wisdom behind worldly pain. That brings us to section 2, egocentrism and divine wisdom, where we'll look at the limits of human logic. Let's define egocentrism in a theological context. It's essentially a cognitive bias. It's the assumption that if we, as human beings, can't fathom a good reason for suffering, then absolutely no justifiable reason can exist, not even within the divine mind. Think about what that means. This assumption effectively superimposes our human limitations onto a transcendent being. It's basically arguing that God must think exactly how humans think, which, logically speaking, contradicts the very definition of transcendence. Now, you might be wondering, is God only merciful and all-powerful? The evidential problem of evil usually isolates just those two attributes. The classic argument asserts that if God is merciful, he should want to stop suffering, and if he's all-powerful, he can stop it. So the fact that suffering exists supposedly disproves his existence. But this deliberately ignores a completely crucial third attribute that we need for a complete philosophical picture. And that missing piece is the attribute of the wise. Since the very nature of the divine includes infinite wisdom, it logically follows that whatever is willed is in line with that wisdom. Think about it. We regularly submit to wisdom we don't fully understand in our everyday lives. We trust a doctor's medical diagnosis without having a medical degree ourselves, right? The central motif here is what we call the pixel versus the picture. We possess merely a fragmented pixel of knowledge, while divine wisdom constitutes the entire limitless picture. So let's look at section 3, the story of Moses and limited perspective, which perfectly illustrates this pixel versus the picture concept. There's a classic theological narrative following Moses, who is a figure of immense spiritual status, traveling with a highly knowledgeable guide named Khidir. During their journey together, Moses witnesses 3 seemingly unjust, highly destructive acts. First, the guide deliberately damages a perfectly functional boat. Second, he is responsible for the passing of a young boy. And third, he actually repairs a wall in a town where the locals had actively refused to show them even basic hospitality. To anyone watching, these actions appear completely irrational and honestly, even evil. But here is the profound reveal. What initially appears as pure evil is later explained, through divinely inspired knowledge, as profound protection and mercy. The boat? It was damaged to make it unserviceable to a tyrant king who was seizing all good ships by force. The boy's passing ultimately protected his highly pious parents from future overwhelming wickedness with the promise of a much more compassionate child. And that wall was repaired because buried beneath it was a treasure belonging to 2 orphans. Keeping the wall intact ensured they would reach maturity and claim their rightful inheritance. This beautifully demonstrates that humility and patience are strictly required to process worldly suffering, simply because we rarely see the hidden variables. Moving on to section 4, free will and moral growth, we're going to talk about the necessity of the test. A really common question comes up here. Why give humans free will at all if it allows for the choice of evil? Well, imagine someone pointing a loaded gun at your head and forcing you to give all your money to charity. Sure, you technically performed a good deed, but that action loses absolutely all moral value. True virtue, true moral elevation absolutely requires the genuine freedom to choose otherwise. Without free will, the test of life just becomes a meaningless exercise. We can actually rationally demonstrate why challenges are required to build character. Think about the relationship between what philosophers call first-order evils and second-order goods. You literally cannot cultivate the second-order good of courage without the first-order evil of danger to overcome. How can humanity possibly develop patience if there is no physical pain or frustration? How can we become truly compassionate if there are no people in desperate need? Moral growth practically requires the presence of these physical and spiritual challenges. Let's shift gears to Section 5, Suffering as Spiritual Purification, and exploring the concept of the ephemeral world. This brings us to a key concept called the dunya, which refers to this lowly, temporary world we currently inhabit. It's characterized by physical limitations, fleeting desires, and inevitable loss. Suffering acts to forcefully break our psychological attachment to this fleeting world. When we experience pain, it acts as a very stark reminder that Earth is an arena of trials, not the final perfected paradise. Detachment from the dunya is viewed as an absolutely necessary step to reach ultimate nearness to the divine. Because the ultimate goal is spiritual purity, every single ounce of pain serves an elevating purpose. In this framework, tests are actually seen as a sign of divine love, a direct avenue to achieve eternal bliss. Every hardship, even something as minor as the prick of a thorn, acts to expiate past wrongs. Illness isn't viewed merely as a biological failure, but as a really profound form of spiritual purification. Remarkably, even fatal illnesses and tragic natural disasters like earthquakes or floods are categorized as forms of martyrdom. This transforms ultimate earthly tragedy into an avenue for absolute forgiveness. And finally, Section 6, Finding Peace in Purpose, Meaning versus Randomness. An atheistic worldview generally concludes that suffering is a blind, random, and completely non-rational physical occurrence. Under this lens, a lifetime of suffering simply ends in the grave with absolutely no ultimate meaning or justice. That lack of ultimate purpose leaves individuals without much deeper emotional recourse. Conversely, the Islamic view shifts suffering from random tragedy to a highly purposeful, structured purification. It guarantees that absolute justice will be served and that infinite recompense is waiting. It provides a massive intellectual and spiritual anchor for anyone seeking to understand how believers can find profound peace, even in the absolute darkest of circumstances. To highlight just how absolute this recompense is, consider this really profound concept. The person who has suffered the most affliction in the entire history of the world will be merely dipped into paradise for a single moment. When asked if they've ever seen hardship or suffering, they will reply that they have never undergone any suffering at all. The philosophical conclusion here is staggering. The eternal joy and perfection of the afterlife so vastly outweighs the temporal, finite pain of this world that the very memory of earthly suffering is completely and instantly eradicated. So it all returns to our vantage point. We're trying to evaluate an infinite design with a distinctly finite mind. If we are only capable of seeing a single pixel, how can we possibly accurately judge the design, the wisdom, and the purpose of the entire picture? I leave you to think on that. See you in the next session.